Keir Starmer says we're in a new era of Tory sleaze, but will the growing allegations and revelations about the close relationship between ministers, civil servants and big business stick to the otherwise Teflon Prime Minister? That's our main story today, and I'll be posing that question to Dalia. Gebrial, how are you doing?
Hi, Michael. I'm doing good. I had my first coffee that wasn't in my house for ages a couple of days ago. So I feel like a new woman. I'm able to pump myself with caffeine outside now.
Have you still got that glow from Monday's coffee, or have you been having more coffee since Monday? I
accidentally had 2 large cappuccinos today, so I'm probably going to need to be physically knocked out tonight if I'm going to my threshold is I'm very sensitive to caffeine, so I'm not on speed basically the way I behave in this show today.
It means we have you on your toes for the show. I like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Heart palpitating.
I'm also going to be posing that question to Adam Ramsey, editor at Open Democracy. And I know that Adam has been just swimming in the Scottish Sea, so you're probably refreshed in probably a healthier way than having 2 large cappuccinos. Is that correct?
Well, it's true. Although actually, while I'm not on speed right now, I was recently prescribed fully effectively speed for ADHD, which is amazing. Oh. So I recommend it to everyone.
Ritalin?
No, it's the other one, methylphenidate.
Interesting. Yeah. Right, I'm keeping Adam for 2 stories today. Because as well as running the website, which has been most consistent in calling out Tory corruption, that's Open Democracy, Adam recently wrote a brilliant piece on the anti-traveller prejudice of Douglas Ross, Scotland's Tory leader. Now, those revelations in Adam's article were raised at the leaders' debate last night. So Douglas Ross had those allegations levelled at him directly, and we're going to be covering that whole controversy as our second story. Also on tonight, how Liz Kendall's defence of care workers ended up insulting people who work in supermarkets, completely unnecessary, and a brewing row within Labour over sex work. I'll be speaking to Lydia Caradonna from the campaign group Decrim Now. Definitely worth the wait for that one. Now, before we get going, if you're new to our show, we do this 3 times a week, and if you want to watch more, hit subscribe. The Greensill scandal is the most damaging cronyism story to have hit Boris Johnson's government, and it seems as if almost every day new details emerge of the cosy relationship enjoyed between Tory ministers, civil servants and big business. Now, on previous Tysky Sows, we've gone over the extraordinary access the disgraced banker Lex Greensill was given within David Cameron's government, and we've gone over how Cameron would go on to work for Greensill and lobby on his behalf. Now, since then, since Monday, we've learned that in 2015, the head of procurement for the civil service under David Cameron, that was Bill Crovers, also took on a job at Greensill. And what's particularly extraordinary about this instance is he did so while he was still working for the government. So he was head of procurement, head of the department which buys services from companies while he was working for a company selling services to the government. Completely unbelievable. Now, the mounting extraordinary revelations that we've received over the past days and weeks led to this brouhaha in the House of Commons this afternoon.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Prime Minister is launching an inquiry. That inquiry isn't even looking at the lobbying rules. I'm not sure it's looking at very much at all, because every day there's further evidence of the sleaze that's now at the heart of this Conservative government. Let's just look, shake your heads, let's just look at the latest scandal. A wealthy businessman, Lex Greensill, was hired as a senior advisor to David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. We've all seen the business card. After he left office, Cameron, became a paid lobbyist for Lex Greensill. Next thing we know, Cameron arranged access for Greensill with cabinet ministers and senior officials. And he lobbied for taxpayers' money on behalf of Greensill Capital. We also know the Chancellor pushed officials. We know the Health Secretary met Cameron and Greensill. We know that senior officials met Greensill Capital regularly. And now, even more unbelievably, we know the government's former head of procurement, no less, became a Greensill advisor while he was still a civil servant. Does the Prime Minister accept there's a revolving door, indeed an open door, between his Conservative government and paid lobbyists?
Mr. Speaker. This is a government and a party that has been consistently tough on lobbying, and indeed we introduced legislation saying that there should be no taxpayer-funded lobbying, that quangos should not be used to get involved with lobbying. We put in a register for lobbyists, and there's one party, Mr. Speaker, that actually voted to repeal the 2014 Lobbying Act, and that was the Labour Party in their historic 2019 election manifesto, which he is yet to repudiate, Mr. Speaker. They did so because they thought it was unfair and was restricting people's ability to make representations to politicians. I think that's absurd. Will he now say that it's absurd to repeal the 2014 Lobbying Act?
Mr. Speaker, he talks of the Lobbying Act. Who was it who introduced that legislation? David Cameron. Who was it who voted for the legislation? Half the Conservative front bench. We said it wouldn't be tough enough. And where did that legislation lead? 2 years later, David Cameron camping out in a Saudi desert with Lex Greensill having a cup of tea. I rest my case in relation to that legislation.
So Starmer, I think, very effectively actually rolling out all of the key allegations against the government when it comes to this particular scandal. Boris Johnson in response says, aha, well, if you're so opposed to lobbying, why did you vote against the lobbying bill, the Lobbying Act? Now, Starmer wasn't in Parliament at that time, but the Labour Party did. Now, the reason Labour did vote against that is because, as Starmer suggests, it didn't do much to stop corruption and cronyism. That's why it seems that none of what has happened so far was illegal, even though it was outrageous. And more importantly, the reason Labour opposed that Lobbying Act was because what it did more than clamp down on big business, clamp down on big money having an influence in politics, it was trying to stop NGOs and trade unions influencing politics. So when Labour opposed that lobbying bill, they were joined by Action for Blind People, Action for Children, the British Heart Foundation, the Campaign to Protect Rural England, the Countryside Alliance, Guide Dogs, Islamic Relief UK, Hope Not Hate, the National Federation of Women's Institutes, the Royal British Legion, the RSPB, and the Salvation Army, amongst others. Now, that is a grouping which represents neither the interests of big capital nor a subsection of the hard left. So I think that argument from Boris Johnson does look a little bit desperate. Now, as well as using PMQs to challenge Boris Johnson on Sleaze, Starmer also took the opportunity to implore MPs to vote with the Labour Party this afternoon in order to set up a parliamentary inquiry into the Greensill affair.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister should be voting with us, not blocking a proper inquiry. The Greensill scandal is just the tip of the iceberg. Dodgy contracts, privileged access, jobs for their mates. This is the return of Tory sleaze. Mr. Speaker, it's now so ingrained in this Conservative government, we don't need another Conservative Party appointee marking their own homework. Actually, Mr. Speaker, the more I listen to the Prime Minister, the more I think that Ted Hastings and AC12 are needed to get to the bottom of this one. Mr. Speaker, we know the Prime Minister will not act against sleaze, but this House can. So can I urge all members of this House to come together this afternoon to back Labour's motion and start to clean up the sleaze and cronyism that's at the heart of this Conservative government.
Prime Minister.
So the joke was kind of cringe, but the point was legitimate. Labour today were encouraging the House of Commons to vote to have a select committee set up to investigate lobbying and to investigate the Greensill scandal. They judge that will be more effective than the independent investigation which the government have set up. They've appointed the person to chair that, who also happens to be an advisor to the business department. So it's not going to be very independent. Labour were pushing for something that would have been effective, I think. It was voted down. So 262 MPs voted to set up that select committee, 357 voted against. Obviously, the Tories did not want that level of scrutiny. There was a bit of a silver lining today, though, because the Treasury Committee have announced their own inquiry into Greensill. So we could still see David Cameron and others hauled in for questioning. Now, the hope from Boris Johnson is that this is going to slide off his back. He probably has some reason to think this when it came to the scandals with PPE, when it came to giving out huge contracts to friends of cabinet ministers. That doesn't seem to have done that much damage. And Adam, I want to bring you in on this because I know that your website has been publishing lots of these revelations when it comes to cronyism on the part of government. And whilst those articles have gone far and they've been very effective, Boris Johnson doesn't seem particularly scared by them, let's say. Do you think this one could be different? Do you think this issue, this Greensill issue, could stick in a way that the pandemic procurement stories haven't?
I think the way I put it is to think about the broad narratives that these, going to the next election, what will people remember? They won't remember the details of each individual scandal. They'll remember an overall sense. And the sense that Boris Johnson wants people to kind of feel is that he's from the ruling class who ought to be in charge and ought to govern us, and that it's entirely fine that he's doling out contracts to other people from the ruling class because that's how the country should be run. And that's very much in the model I think we see particularly in Hungary of Viktor Orban. It's totally consistent that politicians from that kind of further right model over the last decade have, as well as the kind of more racist pandering, essentially, or just racism often, the kind of nationalism they peddled, have alongside that very clearly pushed this kind of contract out to their mates model. And that's a way of securing loyalty in particular bits of the political class, essentially. It's a way of managing those around them. You hand resources, you hand contracts to your mates because that's a good way of getting your mates to do stuff for you. Does the country, eventually get a sense that this isn't a very good idea and it's not the way to run a country? Well, the polls in Hungary, interestingly, have just shown for the first time that, post-pandemic, Fidesz is now behind for the first time in a decade because the opposition parties have united. But I think that that's also because the context of the pandemic, where politics is not kind of no longer just a kind of soap opera going on in some building over there that's quite kind of boring often. It's about our lives. It's very real. It's about death. People have experienced this in a very different way from a huge number of political issues that we watch going on our tellies. And so I do feel like the narrative through the pandemic that the government has really mismanaged it and run it in a and been ultimately corrupt has held pretty well. And I think that we should hope that there's some power there. Sorry, my phone's ringing. We should hope that sticks. But of course, at the same time, we're seeing the opposite narrative being pushed very hard. The big story the media is all covering is the death of Prince Philip, because that's a way of peddling that kind of nationalist myth that the ruling class is who really should be governing us.
When I think of scandals that really land, either they have to be very simple, or you have to have the press willing to go hard on them consistently over and over and over again. So, for example, Labour anti-Semitism, it was that the press went on that over and over again that made that people in the back of their minds, they didn't really know what mural Jeremy Corbyn had liked or which MP had complained about which MP. They just heard this said so often that it was sort of, they absorbed it. Then I think Tory Sleaze in the 1990s was potentially similar. So either you'd need the press to go hard on this, or it would need to be simple enough for people to understand. So for that, I'm thinking of Dominic Cummings. He broke the rules. Everyone knew what the rules were. It was an outrage to everyone. And I'm not saying this in a patronizing way, because I find this controversy very difficult to understand, and I comment on politics for a living. So I'm not saying that people struggle to understand this because it's too complicated for the plebs. No, it's quite a complicated story. Dalia, do you think this could fall into either of those categories? Do you think there's any chance that the media will go so hard on this that the sleaze label sticks to the Conservatives? Or do you think that, Labour potentially can start to pose this in a language which people do understand?
One of the key issues here is that it is becoming it's being reported as a problem of individual corruption, right? And not as the de facto functioning of our state, of the government. And that is not limited just to this particular government, but is historically, especially in recent history, is the kind of de facto position. And when you look at Keir Starmer in particular, and this sort of what we saw at Prime Minister's Questions, I mean, he looked confident, but there's sort of such a lack of strength in the Labour Party's opposition, such a lack of vision of alternative society and a real sense that this is a man who is going to fight for an alternative society, something that is radically different, not just from what we're seeing now, but from what has been politics as usual for several decades. That it just kind of comes off a little bit as a petty political dispute. The one thing that might push it beyond that is if it feels like the media catches onto it as well and sort of parrots it, as you said. But, I think that the problem is that, there is no reason amongst the public to believe that Keir Starmer has the mettle, or that the Labour Party has the mettle to overturn something that has been business as usual for so long, especially because this revolving door issue is something that also exists very much within the Labour Party. Former MP, Angela Smith, Labour MP, she was advocating for the privatisation of water while she was in office, something that a Labour MP should frankly lose the whip for doing. And she then went straight into an executive role in the private water industry. Not to mention that, the era of Labour Party politics that Keir Starmer very much hails, is trying to kind of hark back to, the Blair years, was riddled with stories of, lobbying scandals that came straight from the top. They didn't come from ex-prime ministers. They came from, Tony Blair while he was in office, intervening to exempt Formula One from the ban on tobacco advertising shortly after he had a meeting with Bernie Ecclestone, and Bernie Ecclestone donated £1 million to the party. Not to mention that, the government, and so, so given that the fabric of the two parties at the moment seems so similar, seem to be made from the same material, I think that a lot of these attacks don't feel sincere. They look like politicking, and I think the public don't find that particularly compelling. Not to mention that there have been several other scandals in this government, which we might get onto a bit later. Lobbying scandals and scandals where the government has sort of handed contracts over to incompetent companies that are simply their mates. And that, there have been several of these scandals because this kind of proximity between big business and capital and government is a part of the DNA of the British state. And yet, so in order to really profit off of this, the Labour Party have to not only show that they're going to be a different form of going to demonstrate a different form of governance to this particular party or to this particular government, but that they have the mettle to fundamentally overturn the way that the British state has been functioning for several decades. And Keir Starmer doesn't really look like that's what he is going to do, or that's what he plans on doing.
So you don't have much faith that Keir Starmer is going to make this land. I have a very unscientific poll which backs up your theory. We asked the followers of our YouTube account today a question. We asked them whether they thought that Keir Starmer could make these allegations do significant damage to the Tory party's image. Only 23% of you said it would, and 77% said it wouldn't. Now, 1,800 people voted. As I say, incredibly unscientific poll. I'm not pretending that was a representative sample. Adam, I want to know from you how much you think this does intersect with party politics. As Dalia has said, Tony Blair, that government had, also a lot of cronyism allegations when it came to Formula One, for example. Peter Mandelson, who now it seems is going to be brought into Keir Starmer's team, or at least informally advise him, was completely, neck deep in this kind of thing. Do you think there is an argument the Tories are more corrupt than the Labour Party, or is this just the whole, I suppose, swamp, to use Trumpian terms? And obviously, in this case as well, it's the civil service who are incredibly implicated, just as much as party politicians.
I think there's two things. I mean, the first thing, and Dalia is entirely right, is that this is what the British state is for. The main thing that Britain does economically for the world is provide tax havens through which oligarchs can launder people's money. The Cayman Islands, the British overseas territory, is Britain's biggest economic impact on the world, much more so than manufacturing and our factories. And so, you can't really get to grips with the concept of corruption in Britain without understanding that our whole economy, the City of London, the housing bubble in the City of London is inflated, and this is, the House of Commons Select Committee on Crime and Justice has said this, is inflated by the money of cash laundered through it by oligarchs of the world stealing it from their people. And so, we can't really talk about corruption in the British state without understanding that corruption is the function of and the heart of the British state. It's the first thing I'd say. In terms of party politics, I think there is a big risk that the Labour Party often makes, and this is really the strategic mistake that Ed Miliband made. To some extent, I think Corbyn made it, and we're seeing it particularly with Keir Starmer, is that they think that the alternative to a Conservative government is a Labour government. when historically, normally in the British state, the alternative to one Conservative government is a different Conservative government. And what we're really seeing in a sense here is a battle within the right-wing press. So the allegations you talk through is certainly very good journalism that Rupert Murdoch allowed his journalists at the Times to do because he doesn't like Boris Johnson very much. The Telegraph, on the other hand, does like Boris Johnson. He's their man. And a lot of the tabloids are kind of okay with him at the moment. And if Boris Johnson is replaced because of these scandals, the most likely person to replace him isn't Keir Starmer. It's another Tory politician from another one of those internal factions of the Tory party. And I think that Labour often misunderstands that. They can't just wait in the wings to be the opposition and step into power. The person waiting in the wings is another Tory. They need to push themselves in there somewhere. And Starmer certainly isn't succeeding in doing that at the moment.
So it's about providing alternative as well as taking down the current incumbent.
Well, yeah, and I think, that Dalia is right. That you talk to people around the country, which is a lot of my job to do, and there's a very deep understanding that the political system is broken. And until Labour, the reason the SNP is the most popular party where I am in Scotland is that they have a simple solution to that question. The British state's broken, so vote for us and you'll get independence. And that's a very, very popular prospect. Even people who you don't tell pollsters they'll vote yes, basically understand that message and don't think the SNP are part of that system. Whereas Labour doesn't have an answer to that fundamental question. And if people don't trust politics, then why do they believe anything you're promising them? You say to people, we're going to give you all these good things that Labour was right to promise in 2019. And the first reaction people across the country I spoke to had is, well, we don't trust politicians, we don't trust politics, so why do we believe that you're going to give us those things? And until you can really engage with that deep question of the fact that the British state is fundamentally not built to work for ordinary working people, to use the Blairite phrase, you're never gonna be able to reach them. You're never going to be able to sell them on the things you're trying to offer them, the basic kind of material goods you're offering.
I mean, that's a very good point. I mean, attack them for corruption, but it's got to be part of something much, much bigger, and we're yet to.
People think the whole system is corrupt because it is.
Yeah. And
until you can talk to them about what you're going to do about the fact the whole system is corrupt, they're not going to believe you on the small stuff.
I'm going to go to some comments. Julie Batterson with a £5 super chat says, have to say kudos to hairdressers and essential workers. Thanks, I feel 20 years younger. And we can guess what you've been doing over the past 3 days. Thank you for still having a £5 spare after your haircut and whatever other services you've been, I suppose, acquiring or whatever. And we have a couple actually of really important super chats from Monday left over. So Julie gave a super chat on our last show, which we missed. She said, goodbye, Sue Edgar from Banbury and Bicester CLP and Oxfordshire Socialist Health Association. Thank you for your advocacy, help and championing our cause to keep the NHS public. RIP. And Simon Garrett says, has a similar message. My life has never been affected by Prince Philip, but it has by other people who have contributed far more. People like Sue Edgar who fought for the NHS. Our thoughts go out to those who knew Sue Edgar, who sounds like she made a real difference in the world. So RIP Sue Edgar. Let's go straight on to our next story. Douglas Ross is the Tories leader in Scotland, and he has a problem with travellers. He's been very public about that prejudice. Take a look at this interview Ross did in 2017 as a newly elected MP in Westminster.
If you were Prime Minister for a day, without any repercussions, what would you do?
I'd like to see tougher enforcement against gypsy travellers.
That's right. If Douglas Ross could do any one thing as Prime Minister with no consequences, anything, he wouldn't end hunger or poverty or give a boost to British businesses. This is a Tory after all. Rather, he would persecute gypsy travellers. Now, thanks to Adam Ramsey at Open Democracy, we've also learned that Ross's obsession with travellers goes back further than 2017. So in this article, which was published this week, we can get up the headline in a moment, I think. Adam reveals that when Douglas Ross was a councillor in Moray, North East Scotland, he led a campaign to block the development of a legal traveller site. Now, this happened in 2010. A traveller had brought a plot of land to develop into a site and complained that Ross would regularly appear at the bottom of their drive taking pictures Douglas Ross also went around local farms encouraging people to sign a petition against the granting of planning permission for the site. This is someone who's really obsessed with stopping this person get planning permission for a traveller site. We know there's a huge shortage of traveller sites across the UK. Now, unfortunately for Douglas Ross, local supporters of the traveller community in question gathered even more signatures in support of the development than Ross managed to collect in opposition. This was an obvious example of democracy in action. However, Ross wasn't happy with this outcome, and he complained, "I am disappointed and frustrated that we seem to have to bend over backwards for this ethnic minority." This is the man who is currently leader of the Scottish Tories. He wants to be First Minister of Scotland, and he said this kind of thing about ethnic minorities who are discriminated against. Now, on May the 6th, Douglas Ross will be standing to become First Minister, and there was a debate last night for those elections. So all of the leaders of the Scottish parties stood up and argued why they should be elected on the 6th of May. And in that debate, the co-leader of the Scottish Greens, Patrick Harvey, challenged Ross on his record of prejudice.
I want to suggest to you that you've built your political career on divisive language and actions against one of Scotland's most marginalised communities, the Gypsy Traveller community. It's not just your claim when you were asked if you were Prime Minister for a day what your first action would be, tougher enforcement against Gypsy travellers. You've campaigned against their right to legal traveller sites for a decade, and when your attempt to stop one of them failed, you complained about what you called having to bend over backwards for this ethnic minority. Is it your whole party that's prejudiced against Gypsy travellers, or just you?
I've apologised for the comments I made in the interview you have cited. They were wrong. It was the wrong answer to the question, which was well put, and I should have answered it far better. There are so many other priorities that I could have answered with and I should have answered with, and I apologise for that. But on the later case that you cite, in my 10 years as a local councillor and in my time as an MSP and an MP, I've always stood up for constituents who have come to me seeking action on issues that they are worried about. And there was a big issue. Have you stood up for Gypsy travellers who don't have legal sites? Or have you tried to block those legal sites? There was a big issue, and we formerly had a legal site. It had to be closed by over 100 officers from the former Grampian Police because of illegal activity which took place there. So I will continue to act on behalf of constituents who come to me as a representative seeking help and to advocate the points they put forward. Your constituents are also Gypsy travellers. Do you acknowledge that this is a long persecuted community in Scotland, and what will you personally do to make amends for the way that you've broken trust with them and appear to support campaigns that are discriminatory against them? Well, there is far more I can do and everyone can do. You know, I've had communication during this election on the cross-party group that's established in Westminster and also the one that I am sure will be re-established in Holyrood. So there's definitely more we can do for Gypsy travellers here in Scotland. And what are you personally going to do? Well, I'm willing to open those discussions, to accept the mistakes I've made in the past, but also work with all communities here in Scotland going forward. But I will never ever refuse to stand up to constituents who come to me seeking help, seeking support, and I think that's the right thing for an elected politician.
So you heard there, he apologised for saying that his #1 priority were he to become Prime Minister would be to persecute Gypsy travellers. However, there was no apology either for organising to try and stop the traveller site get legal approval, nor apology for complaining that people were bending over backwards for an ethnic minority. Adam Ramsey, I suppose, first of all, well done for having the revelation in your article be brought up in the Scottish leaders debate. To begin though, could you talk about the broader article in that piece? So you were saying that Ross's own habit of targeting Gypsy travellers taps into a deeper history and deeper presence of racism against travellers in Scotland. So, I mean, very briefly, can you summarise your argument?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first thing people need to understand is that there are a number of distinct different Gypsy and traveller groups in Scotland. I think a lot of people aren't aware that, like Ireland, Scotland has, the Highlands in particular, have an Indigenous traveller group, which is, it often interacts with, but is distinct ethnically and historically from the Gypsy Roma tradition who arrived around 1500 in Scotland. So for at least 1,000 years, there's been a nomadic group in Scotland with their own language, their own culture, etc. And so that's what we're really talking about. Murray is up in the Highlands. So when we're talking about Douglas Ross, we're talking primarily about Highland travellers. an ethnic group which are very rarely talked about in British politics. And there's a very long history. So from the 1570s, it was legal to kill gypsies, as in Roma gypsies. From 1609, James VI passed a law which again reinforced you could kill gypsies, and also banned any kind of support for traveller communities. And that history goes on, and we could talk about that in detail. But one of the things I discovered when I started interviewing elders in the traveller community over the last couple of months, which I had no idea about. I grew up in rural Perthshire, where there's a lot of travel. There were a lot of travellers as a kid. I knew this history, I thought. What I didn't understand is that from about the 1890s, there was a long phenomenon of essentially taking children off traveller families, kidnapping them as the state, and then deporting them to colonies in order to essentially try and ban the nomadic lifestyle. And that was fairly explicit. A policy which started, by the way, in a report written by George Trevelyan, who was the Secretary of State for Scotland at the time, whose father, Charles Trevelyan, is the man some of you might know, notorious for being behind a lot of what went wrong in the Irish famine, who said that famine was an effective solution to the population problem, as he put it. It's essentially a quasi-genocidal policy. And I spoke to people whose grandparents or had siblings deported, taken from their parents by the state and deported to Canada and to Australia. This is a story which has never really been told outside the traveller community. It's really shocking. And this very active attempt to force travellers to settle, and if they refuse to settle, literally taking their children off them. And that is a story that's still live today. So, one elder in the traveller community in Angus told me that she'd intervened when the police were trying to stop some travellers stopping on her site near her house, up by Montrose in Scotland, a few years ago. And the police said to the parents of this family, if you don't do what we tell you, we'll arrest you. And then what do you think will happen to your children? In other words, fine well that then we'll take them off you. So this threat is still held over the traveller community. And that's the context that Douglas Ross's behaviour arrives in, that there is a very virulent racism against that particular community. In my primary school growing up, this was the most familiar kind of racism. It was very popular to bash, traveller children, and to, accuse others if they were seen as, I don't want to repeat the tropes, but
yeah.
And so when Douglas Ross is pushing this idea, this hatred of travellers, it's true. This is a very common form of racism among his electorate. And when he says, that I don't back down from speaking up for my voters, I'm sure he's right that a large percentage of people who support him do hold racist views against travellers in the area, and that he is accentuating, whipping up, and representing those views. But it's we can all see it for what it is.
And what's the status of party politics when it comes to attitudes or policies, I suppose, more importantly, towards the traveller community? I mean, we've been talking recently in England about how both the Labour Party and the Tory Party are guilty of marginalising, at least in their literature, in the way they speak about travellers, that community. From people I've spoken to, policy between the two parties does actually differ a reasonable amount. What's the situation in Scotland? Is what Douglas Ross is saying particularly grotesque compared to the other party leaders? And I suppose most importantly, because they are going to win the next election, what's the SNP's relationship to the traveller community in Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, so the SNP have just allocated about £20 million to invest in traveller sites and to support traveller culture. I think to go back a little bit into the geography and history of this, we're talking about the northeast of Scotland, which is really where the SNP grew up. I've had an SNP MP in the constituency I grew up in since '97. Back when there were only very few. The area, Banff was previously an SNP seat before. Moray was previously an SNP seat before Douglas Ross took it. So this is kind of the SNP heartland, and the class politics in the region is that basically working class people vote SNP on the whole, and landowners, wealthier people, tend to vote Tory as they do across the UK. And unsurprisingly, it's fairly consistently the case that the people who particularly don't like travellers are landowners, and the working class communities have traditionally had much better relationships, often, partly because travellers are working class and they will work. Firstly, they sometimes vote themselves, so there's very low turnout rates, but also there'll be much more personal familiarity. And so, the SNP has, to its credit, tended to not have much, have any time for anti-traveller racism. I don't want to praise them too much because there's a lot more that needs to be done. The 20 years that I talk about at the end of my article, where there's been a massive decline in visible signs of travelling communities. So when I was a child, you would see them round about, and now you don't. And obviously the SNP has been in charge for a large chunk of that time, and that's they've allowed that process to take place. But they have tried, and they've done some things. They need to do more. But certainly there is a very big party split, and the parties were unanimous to some extent in condemning Douglas Ross for his comments. And to be honest, even Ruth Davidson, the previous Scottish Tory leader, wouldn't be caught saying this kind of thing. This is very much out with the bounds of traditional political rhetoric in Scotland. There is a lot of prejudice there, but normally even the Tories have kept a cap on saying this kind of thing publicly.
And while we've got you, can I ask you more generally about the Scottish elections which are coming up? I mean, you've mentioned that Douglas Ross is quite a different candidate to I've forgotten her name. Oh my God, so embarrassing. What was the previous? Ruth Davidson. Yeah. My apologies. He is a very different candidate to Ruth Davidson. He seems, in a way, he's very brash. He seems to be not particularly popular in Scotland. Are the Tories going to tank? I mean, the SNP look like they are going to. I mean, they're going to stomp home in this election. So in a way, it's a battle for second place. Who is going to be the main opposition to the SNP? Is it going to be the Conservatives or the Labour Party? Do you see that as the real story at this election? And is it still in play, or are Labour, already relegated to third place?
Well, so the real story that everyone's following is, will the pro-independence parties, i.e. the SNP and Greens, get a majority? And of course, because it's a proportional system, it's not like Westminster where it's automatically the case that the governing party is very likely to have a majority. The SNP got a majority once in 2011. In the last parliament, between them, the two parties had a majority. If there's the third parliament with majority of pro-independence MSPs, who, whereas in 2016, remember the last Holyrood election was before the Brexit referendum. So both parties had said, if there's a Leave vote, then we'll be in favour. But that's a more complex manifesto promise to where we are now, which is both parties say, if we get a majority, we have mandate for a referendum on independence. So that's the real question everyone's asking. And the secondary question, as you say, is who will be the opposition party, the biggest opposition party? Will it be Tories or Labour? Now, you're right that Douglas Ross is a very different figure from Ruth Davidson. Ruth Davidson was a sort of attempt to appeal to the kind of Cameronite, we're liberal Tories. She was, her seat is Edinburgh Central, which is, very kind of, it's quite rich, but it's sort of younger. And she had to win over like former Lib Dem voters basically to get that seat. Douglas Ross has no pretense of that. This is the Brexiting Tory party. There's no liberals in Scotland who don't mind the Tories so much if they're Ruth Davidson and not voting for them now. But of course, there is, if you think about the percentages, what they got was 24% last time. That was seen as the great Tory success of Ruth Davidson, 24%. That's about as many people as, are there 24% of people who support Brexit and oppose independence in Scotland? Well, there might well be, and you think about those as the two defining issues. And will those people go and vote Tory in this election? Possibly. The Tories have carved out a niche, which is about 25% of the country. It's the kind of most right-wing 25% of the country. Labour doesn't have an obvious niche. Who is going to vote Labour or Lib Dem in this election? Well, if you are against Brexit but don't want to do anything about it, in favour of the union but not a Tory, then sure, that you've got those parties to vote for, but it's not the same obvious niche. So I'd see it more that way. Who's the base for these different parties? And people are going to vote for Tories, because they basically support Tories. And Douglas Ross, continues to be a Tory, and is very visibly so. And so, will they get somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of the vote? I would guess so. What does that tell you about Scotland? That about a quarter of people are Tories, which has always been the case, really?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. If you're not going for a majority, then being a bit brash and offensive to most people doesn't matter that much if it can solidify the niche that you have. Adam Ramsey, thank you so much for joining us this evening. All incredibly insightful, and yeah, well done on getting that article mentioned on the Scottish leaders debates. It was great to see Douglas Ross challenged so strongly in that way.
It was I cheered. It was wonderful. It was a lot of fun last night.
Adam Ramsey, do check out Adam's work on open democracy. It's really worth your attention. Dalia, I want to bring you in on that issue and sort of seeing. I mean, in a way, obviously, the fact that this guy is a party leader in Scotland is depressing. At the same time, the fact that you're having this reactionary, I mean, I think we can call him racist, candidate who has no chance of winning, and also who was challenged quite robustly on television is quite refreshing if we compare it to English politics. I mean, what do you make of that story and that challenge that was very publicly made to Douglas Ross?
Yeah, I mean, once again, kudos to Adam Ramsey for putting that on the map. And I think it's a good thing that the left, that, anti-racist movements are beginning to really have this conversation and take action on this issue of anti-GRT racism, because we've kind of failed on this issue for a really long time, even though the pervasiveness of anti-GRT racism across the political spectrum, as you guys mentioned, in the Labour Party in England, is very much part of the politics, especially on the local level. This is absolutely integral and part of the state's racial character. In particular, and there's so many connections and consistencies between how anti-GRT racism operates and how racism against other racialized communities operates. This connection to property, this idea of property ownership, of property itself being valued above the lives of racialized minorities, where, detachment from property is seen as such a threat to capitalism. And that threat becomes racialized and articulated through racialized threats, that are constructed around the GRT community. And, the charge of rootlessness, the idea of rootlessness, something that we've historically seen leveled against Jews, leveled against migrants, which again, threatens the idea of the nation state. And that's why we see these particular racialized formations around these ideas of nomadic lifestyles. The idea of property as, being a higher property ownership, as being a higher form of citizenship. Is that not similar to what we see when, Black and brown people protest against something that is causing harm or death in their community, and the story becomes damage against property that might have happened in the protest? And even the why do we bend over backwards to this ethnic minority? Again, it rings so strong against this idea that we've seen, particularly in the wake of Brexit, but also happening a lot longer before that, is this idea that, the state is being overrun by racialized minorities and it needs to display its might through violence and through force against these racialized minorities. So there's incredibly important and pertinent connections between anti-GRT racism and racism experienced by other racialized communities. And so we must fight these things in solidarity with one another. But it's also when we talk about the failure of the left and the failure of parts of the anti-racist movement as well, there is something to be said, I think, about how when you look at sort of the compromise between the state and the streets that happened through the kind of state multiculturalist doctrine in the 1990s, where, street-based anti-racist movements were kind of absorbed into this, state multiculturalism, where we became sort of siphoned into these little individual categories and told we don't need to organize on the streets anymore because, we can just apply for different bodies of funding from the government and, sit on committees and stuff. So the GRT community was left out of that. They were shunned from even the most mealy-mouthed olive branch from liberalism, from the state during that era. And now we're paying the price as we are seeing that this kind of anti-GRT racism is becoming the grounds upon which the state is sharpening its tools and sharpening its weapons. And we can see this in the attack on GRT communities in the crime and policing bill. We see it in the ramping up of this kind of anti-GRT racism seen as the sort of legitimate racism that can be deployed even from the Labour Party and across the and that, you know, the left is going to sort of sit by and let that happen. And it is becoming such an integral part of the consolidation of a reactionary and racist politics across the party spectrum that is going to have impact on all of us, whether or not we are part of the GRT community. So I think it's really important for us to really begin to gain literacy on the centrality of this form of racism to how the British state and also states across Europe define themselves and extract their and consolidate their power, and really factor this in to part of our struggle against that. And it's really important, and it's really important for journalism like Adam Ramsey's, and also for campaigns and, you know, organizing by the GRT community to really put these issues on the map.
Something quite rare has happened. We've got a comment I disagree with. It's from Sunil Basu with a £5. He says, you don't want to mention it was a Green, do you, Novara? You're not very independent if you only see the god of first past the post Labour victory. I'm pretty sure I mentioned it was a Green. It was the co-leader of the Green Party. I mentioned that in my introduction. I'm sure I did. And also, I'm in favour of proportional representation. I think we should have proportional representation across the UK. So I reject that allegation, I'm afraid. You got us wrong there. But you are right that credit to the Green Party for tackling Douglas Ross on that. It's probably not a surprise that it was the Greens, not the Labour Party, who made that very strong challenge. Before we go on to our next story, do like the video. Now, in the words of her local paper, Labour MP Diana Johnson is on a crusade to make paying for sex a criminal offence. To that end, Diana Johnson is leading attempts to pass a sexual exploitation bill which would criminalise purchasing sex and make it illegal for websites to advertise sex. She has also called for amendments to the police and crime bill which would have the same effect. Now, Johnson, justifying these moves, claims it would have the effect for suppressing demand for sex work and therefore would undermine the profitability of trafficking. And the moves, which would bring Britain in line with the so-called Nordic model, have the support of high-profile MPs such as Dame Margaret Hodge, Harriet Harman and Stella Creasy. So a wide degree of high-profile support there on the Labour benches. However, this drive to criminalise purchasing sex has also provoked opposition, including from sex workers themselves. The organisation Decrim Now advocates to fully decriminalise the sex work industry, and they've released an open letter to MPs arguing that the Nordic model, far from limiting harm from trafficking, would increase the risks faced by sex workers. Signatories of that letter include Amnesty International, the GMB Union, LGBT plus Labour, Momentum, and Labour MPs Nadia Whittome and Zara Sultana. Now, to discuss the Nordic model and the issues raised by this row within Labour, I'm joined by Lydia Caradonna, an organiser with Decrim Now, who organised that open letter. Thank you so much for joining the show this evening. First, I want to start by asking you why your organisation are so opposed to attempts to introduce the Nordic model in Britain, which, just to clarify for the audience, is most importantly to criminalise buying sex, to criminalise being a client of a sex worker, and to criminalise advertising sex work. Why do you think that would be a big problem?
Absolutely. So the big takeaway from the Nordic model is that people die. So in just 6 months after it was introduced in France, 10 sex workers have been murdered. The way that the Nordic model works is it criminalises clients, which means that you need to protect clients from the police in order to still be able to see them. It's not like you can just stop seeing clients because of poverty, which is why people are in the sex industry in the first place. So in order to see clients, you have to see them in more and more isolated places like woodlands. You have to avoid taking things like legal names, which sex workers currently use to screen clients and to pass on which clients are bad. You have to protect them from all of that. And also any reduction in demand shifts the power back into the hands of the clients, because sex workers still need to see clients to be able to eat and pay rent, right? So in France, in Northern Ireland, we've seen it become more and more difficult to demand things like condom usage. and people are having to do services that they would not normally do just in order to make ends meet. We also saw in both France and Northern Ireland, there was absolutely no reduction in demand, but there was a huge increase in violence against sex workers. So this, coupled with banning advertising platforms that sex workers use to stay independent and not have to rely on things like pimps or managers, is really a violent move against the sex industry, sort of masquerading as rescue. It's not a rescue at all.
I want to bring up a tweet from Diana Johnson. So she responded particularly to Momentum signing this open letter. So Momentum, the left-wing group in the Labour Party, she quote tweeted them and said, "Why is Momentum on the side of pimps, traffickers and organised crime and not women? They sexually exploit women and girls and make huge profits. Sexual exploitation is violence against women, and we need to drive down demand, hold sex buyers accountable and support women exiting the sex trade." Now, how would you respond to that? And her argument there is that this will make, if we do the Nordic model, it will make life harder for traffickers and people who exploit women. It will make the industry less profitable. How would you respond to that tweet from Diana Johnson?
I mean, I have some choice words. First of all, are we not women? Why is it that they seem to believe that, you know, we're being raped every day? We don't understand how to consent. If we're such victims, why do they speak to us so awfully? Why do they not trust us? Why do they not listen when we speak about our own experiences of violence? And first of all, like, demand has not reduced in Northern Ireland. There is absolutely no empirical evidence that it has reduced trafficking, even in Sweden. In Sweden, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe saw absolutely no empirical evidence that trafficking had been reduced. The Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention saw no evidence that trafficking had been reduced. Like, there is absolutely no evidence that it happens. And the way that we deal with trafficking in any other sector has not been to criminalize entire sectors. How are we going to have good labor rights at work if our workplaces are continually criminalized? Like, as it stands, I can't go to employment tribunal about my boss, can I? In what world, especially in what world is the Labour Party, which is claiming to stand for workers, making it harder for us to organise, taking the power away from workers, and subjecting us to more and more police involvement when police are historically one of the most violent groups towards us? In what world is that helping us? So yeah, I honestly, Diana Johnson, I think it's disgusting. I think you should actually listen to us for once. And I think the way that we are being dismissed as pimps when this is our lives, our bodies, our experiences that you're trying to criminalize is disgusting and misogynistic, honestly.
I suppose the response to some of what you'd say would be to potentially, I suppose, assume or believe that maybe there is a bit of a division within sex work between people who do have autonomy and have made this decision as a choice, and then people who are being exploited, who have been pressured into the industry by traffickers or pimps or whatever. Is that a figment of my imagination, or is that something that actually exists? And while what Diana Johnson is proposing would be of a real negative to someone like you, for other people it might be beneficial. Is there anything to that?
It's far less of a clean divide. So the way you have to look at it is that with choices come power, right? So I, in my life, have had very little choice about doing sex work. And I have a pimp now. So, you know, I would surely fall into this group that needs to be rescued. Whereas some of my friends who are entirely independent, and independence which would be taken away by this law and would push them into the hands of pimps and traffickers, they might be considered in the first group, or this like mythical group of, you know, happy hookers, and apparently happy hookers the only ones advocating for decriminalization. But actually it's this big continuum where we slide in and out of poverty based on our circumstances. We have more choices and less choices at certain points. And it's really setting up this idea of this like mythical, I guess, pimp figure, a figure which is often actually racialized, especially when it comes to talking about trafficking. It's setting up this enemy, and we just need to tackle the enemy, and then the whole sex industry is solved. But that's not true. What we need to tackle is poverty. I know so many sex workers, including myself, who would not be doing sex work if we had easier ways to make ends meet that fit around childcare, that fit around disability, that fit around language barriers, that fit around visas that have limited working hours on. There's all of these other issues that Labour is normally so good on that apparently go out of the window when there's a penis involved. In what world? In what world is the answer to any of this making it harder for us to work? It's not. Like, if there are issues in our sector, which I will be the first to say there are, I hate my job, I've experienced so much violence, then the answer has never been to take the power further away from the worker. It has always been to give workers more power. And as part of a Labour movement, we should know that. This shouldn't need to be said.
And I suppose that moves us on to my next question, which is, what Diana Johnson and her supporters are pushing for is to further criminalise the sex industry and sex work. At the moment, it seems to me seems to be a very grey area when it comes to sex work in this country. You're presumably not only opposed to what Diana Johnson is proposing, but you'd like to go further in the other direction, right? I mean, your organisation is called Decrim Now. What would decriminalising sex work mean? How would it be different to what is currently the status quo?
So currently you can buy and sell sex in the UK, that is all fine, but lots of things around it are criminalised, and the things that have been criminalised tend to punish poor people. So you can be arrested and fined for working on the street, which most people don't do because they like the weather, right? They do it because there's no other option. You are completely criminalised for working together for safety. So even if it is just you and a friend working from the same flat, that counts as a brothel because there's two of you. You are both brothel keepers and pimping each other out. So we have to work more and more isolated ways in order to avoid that. You're not allowed to have any help at all because of third-party laws. So this is all like terrible, especially if you're in the industry because you're disabled, or even if you share a bank account with a partner who is barely involved in your work. That's being criminalised. And all of the things that these laws are supposedly preventing are still happening. I still work in a brothel. I just have absolutely no rights. All of this stuff has not disappeared. Criminalisation does not make things disappear. Like, we've seen this throughout history. Criminalisation just pushes things further and further underground. We're not saying that decriminalisation is going to solve all of the problems in the sex industry. That's irrational. What we're saying is if we decriminalise, that puts us on the same footing as other workers to be able to unionise properly, to be able to hold our employers to account, to be able to access services without stigma and judgment. Decriminalisation is the way that we bring power back into the workers and we get to change the conditions that we're currently working in.
And finally, I mean, I think one of the arguments from Diana Johnson and that strand of feminism really is to say that the fact that you can purchase sex in society has an effect on the status of all women. And I don't find that argument particularly convincing on the surface, but there is situations. So, for example, in Amsterdam, if you go through the red light district, there are whole streets where the windows are full of women sort of dancing naked. And I can kind of see how maybe that does affect how people in society see women. Do you think that there is a bit of a balance to be struck? And if it were to be decriminalized, we should have sort of maybe regulations so that it doesn't just become like any other sort of consumerist, capitalist industry?
Sexism does not exist because of the sex industry. The sex industry exists because women have been economically disadvantaged, because we've been sexualized throughout history, because there has been a patriarchy, because we've had very few employment options. So, you know, if you found a law, which I don't believe exists, and you could bring the law in and it would get rid of the sex industry entirely, you know, their husbands still wouldn't respect them. The patriarchy would still be a thing. People would still be catcalled. There would still be sexual violence. So this idea that sex workers should be volunteered as collateral damage when we're already facing so much violence is really disgusting. Like, I'm not volunteering myself and my co-workers in order to win some ideological battle about whether or not men should be able to pay for sex, when actually all that's going to do is make our lives worse and be a symbolic victory at best. The patriarchy is still going to be there.
Lydia Caradonna, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Super interesting, super insightful. Thank you. We have a comment on that interview. Rajia D with a $9.99 super chat. Thank you very much. This is awful. If you want to reduce sex work, then the way to do it is improve the material conditions of women. Demand for this industry will never go down. Comment which very much echoes everything that Lydia's been saying. Dalia, I want to bring you in on this and talk about when it comes to the division within feminism on this question. It seems a bit, another one of those issues, a bit like trans rights, where obviously the divide is not absolute, but there does seem to be a bit of a difference when it comes to the age of people. So it's probably not a coincidence that the people who are backing Diana Johnson on this are, include Harriet Harman, who I think is the mother of the House. So she is the oldest female MP in the House of Commons, and one of the signatories of the letter who is backing decriminalisation is the youngest MP, which is Nadia Whittome. Is this another issue where generational divides really do matter, and potentially, the dominant position within feminism could change quite quickly and quite dramatically?
I think it's less an issue about age and more an issue about power. The power to define who is the woman in women's rights, a power that emerges from a scarcity mentality that thinks that there is only a certain number of resources that can be allocated to women. And so we need to create very harsh boundaries around who the deserving woman is in order to conserve those resources and make sure that they go in the quote unquote right hands. I think that, that tradition is very alive and well in the Labour Party. The Labour Party has a problem with women, and weirdly, it comes mostly from women Labour MPs. And it's that tradition of a particular kind of very reactionary ideology, which I think masks itself as feminism, which is centered around constructing an acceptable womanhood who is entitled to the gains of the feminist movement. Even though the gains of those feminist movements are built off the people that are not considered good women by a lot of these people. And it's, that acceptable womanhood is a highly professionalized, middle class, white, cisgendered womanhood, and it defines itself through its opposition to and willingness to marginalize and oppress women who exist outside of that category. So there's a connection there between the anti-trans feminism, the anti-sex work feminism, the white feminism. It's all around creating these very harsh boundaries and these very sharp edges around the category of womanhood. So we see women MPs, who have built their backs off a feminist reputation, endorsing extremely reactionary and harmful rhetoric and policy against racialized communities like Sarah Champion in the name of women's safety. We see cis women MPs standing up to trans women in the name of women's safety, which is an oxymoron. Like Rosie Duffield. We see people like Jess Phillips who boast about bullying Diane Abbott, and other MPs who are mentioned here who are pushing through legislation that is harmful to sex workers and therefore harmful to the migrant women, the working class women, the disabled women who predominantly make up the sex work industry for all the reasons that Lydia outlined. And so, I see those things as very connected. And when I say that I think the issue is about power, I think it's really interesting that a lot of the elders of, Black feminism, Angela Davis, people who are in the same generation as a lot of the titans of sort of anti-trans, anti-sex work feminism, hold those politics. And it's because they know what it's like to be on the other end of that, the other side of that sharp category of womanhood. And they know that we don't get anywhere by restricting and relying on the model of the good woman. They know that is a category that has very sharp edges. So I think that the age thing is a bit of a kind of cop out. I don't think this is an ideology that is just going to be sort of like grown. We're just going to sort of grow out with. I think it is really an issue about power and about feminism, a feminism that doesn't have a class analysis, that doesn't have a race analysis, that doesn't have an understanding of how these things are connected. That is, reproducing a scarcity logic and a hoarding of resources within the movement. And I think that Decrim Now have done a really good job of making this into a Labour issue and not making it into a moralising issue. The question is not, do you think someone should be able to buy sex? That's irrelevant. Your feelings about that don't matter. It is a question of workers' rights. And if you care about the actual safety and empowerment of women, of people who sell sex, then you would listen to them when they tell you about what they need in order to stay safe and in order to exit the industry if that's what they want to do. But I think that essentially what we have here is that attempt to create a feminist reputation off the backs of the women who actually are instrumental in anything that we can claim as a feminist gain over the past several decades. So yeah, I think that it's much more of an issue of power rather than generation or age.
We've got another great comment. Ricochet tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour, get Lydia into Parliament. I wholly agree. That would definitely, liven up the Labour benches. Although, I mean, I think if you've sent any negative tweet about the Labour Party at this point, it's going to be very hard to become an MP in Keir Starmer's Labour. So it'll be a challenge. We're going to go to our final story. First of all, you know the score. We do love your super chats. What we appreciate the most is our regular supporters. You really do make this organisation possible. If you are already donating the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, thank you so much. If not, please do go to novaramedia.com/support. Carers in Britain do one of the most important and difficult jobs in the country, and they do it for appalling pay. So it's only right that Labour challenged the Tories vociferously on their abandonment of the sector. However, when Liz Kendall, who is Shadow Minister for Care, attacked the government on pay for carers, she also managed to piss off another group of key workers. Let's take a look.
Despite repeated promises, the truth is you'd be better off stacking shelves at Morrison's than caring for older or disabled people, and that is simply not good enough for our country.
So that was a debate on Tuesday in the House of Commons. Liz Kendall, I mean, the motivation of the intervention was good. She's saying you don't pay carers enough, but for some reason, for some arbitrary reason, I'm not sure why she thought it was a good idea, she made that point by essentially denigrating, or seeming to denigrate at least, the work of people who work in supermarkets. So she's saying, oh, how could it possibly be the case that we value care less than working in a supermarket? Now, understandably, this pissed off many people who work in supermarkets. Let's go to some responses on Twitter from people who are supermarket workers who weren't particularly pleased with what Liz Kendall said there. First tweet: as a shelf stacker myself, I think the people that have been on the front lines through all this deserve a bit more respect than being someone to be scoffed at. Very reasonable point there. This worker from the very supermarket Liz Kendall mentioned, of the supermarket chain Liz Kendall mentioned, also pretty pissed off. This is vile and disrespectful. Liz Kendall should hang her head in shame. Yours sincerely, a Morrison's worker. Now, this statement was also predictably pounced upon by opposition politicians, in this case, much more opportunistically than the tweets I've shown you previously. So this was the Tory leader in the London Assembly. She says, let me take this opportunity to say thank you to shelf stackers in supermarkets. You are valued hugely by the majority of us. I am sick to death of some constantly belittling certain jobs. Everyone who does an honest job is valuable to all of us in society. Dalia, I want to bring you in on this. Now, it would have been pretty easy to challenge the low pay of carers without devaluing other low paid workers. What do you think Liz Kendall was trying to do there?
I mean, what an ignorant and just appalling comment to make, especially now when you thought we would have learned our lesson on, about work, about what kinds of work are actually essential, what kinds of work are very difficult and are very skilled, and that has actually rarely corresponded to how that work is valued in society, both either socially or economically. And, it actually, there is actually a connection between the devaluing of care work and the devaluing of, shelf stacking and supermarket work, because it tends to be the work that makes our world a much more hospitable place that seems to be undervalued in our society. And it's the work that makes our world less hospitable that is somehow much more valued and rewarded in society. And what is the job of the Labour Party if not to fight that paradigm that some workers are not worthy of respect, rather, and not only to reinforce it, but proudly reinforce it. This wasn't like some kind of gotcha moment. This wasn't like Twitter sleuths like digging up past comments. This was something that a speech that Liz Kendall wrote, or someone wrote for her, she read out and then posted it to her own Twitter page, which is just such a sign of where the Labour Party, or where at least parts of the Labour Party are now. And it represents a kind of really disgusting, what is often called aspiration politics, that has plagued the Labour Party. It's also plagued, liberal anti-racist movements, quote unquote movements. And it's an approach that basically says that working class people, or, racially minoritized people, should keep intact the hierarchies that run our world, regardless of how illogical, how damaging they are, and fight for our claim to have a few seats at the top of this false hierarchy. It's like a framework of empowering yourself by keeping the rest of your class or your group down. And the reason I make that connection is because this reminded me of, when liberals, sort of people of color in upper class jobs, like lament their experiences of racism through the lens of like, oh, I'm a CEO, but I get mistaken for a cleaner. Like, isn't that so terrible? Isn't that the sharp edge of racism? Rather than thinking, why are we accepting the premise that being a cleaner is something that shouldn't be respected and valued and paid well? Why are we accepting the premise that it is an insult to be mistaken for a cleaner? Because let me tell you, a world without CEOs is probably going to be much nicer than a world without people who clean our streets, our homes, our buildings, etc. But working class people, people of color, are encouraged to express their politics through these means, precisely because it is so reactionary and it does so much to destroy solidarity, and particularly to destroy class solidarity. Like, think how much the liberal press loves the story about, a professional being mistaken for their help, quote unquote. It's seen as the ultimate, the ultimate evidence of racism, even though, or, even though that paradigm is itself part of the problem. So when I was hearing this about Liz Kendall, not only did I think, oh my God, have you learned nothing over the past year? But I also, it kind of rang a bell with that sort of trope in a lot of liberal anti-racism that also really pisses me off. And I thought, God, this is just such an example of how liberalism has just cannibalized our movements of all of their radical potential. But the good thing is that I definitely think the younger generation, the generations that are taking to the streets, the generations that are becoming very disillusioned with this kind of politics, they're not just accepting that kind of representation, aspirational politics. And so that's kind of where I pin my hope when I switch on Twitter and I see just this absolutely ghastly, self-aggrandizing, disgusting form of politics that makes me so bristle at the idea that she is in a party that is called the Labour Party, and to be outflanked by a Tory as well. Just embarrassing. So embarrassing.
Oliver Kant with a fiver agrees with your sentiment. He says, the likes of toilet cleaners and shelf stackers have done more work for this country than any civil servant, aristocrat or corpo, I'm not sure what that is, corporation maybe, have ever done. I think quite right. It really is bizarre for Liz Kendall and her team, and Keir Starmer, because we know he's quite authoritarian when it comes to what frontbenchers tweet out. Thought that was okay after a year where literally, in March last year, everyone was saying the heroes of this moment are people who work in supermarkets, because while everyone else was self-isolating, they had to go out in the middle of the pandemic and make sure that we could all feed ourselves. And, the pandemic isn't even over. And they're already using people who work in supermarkets as the example of people whose work is presumably valueless. The facts she was pointing to are also a little bit more ambiguous than she suggested. First of all, you're watching Tysky's Hour on Novara Media. We go live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. If you haven't already, do hit that subscribe button. Let's go to the facts of the matter, because, as I say, they aren't as clear-cut as Liz Kendall suggested. So I Googled this after watching that clip. I think she might have been referring to there was a blog from the King's Fund. So they're the main NGO or research organization when it comes to healthcare. Now, they wrote a report in 2019 that was comparing the pay of people in the care sector and people who worked in supermarkets. And we can get up here the comparisons they made. So at this point in time, they did judge that people who worked in care did get significantly worse pay than most people in supermarkets. So the King's Fund found the average pay for carers was £7.90 per hour, appalling wage there. Iceland was the only supermarket chain that paid less than that, £7.80 outside of London. Tesco slightly higher, which was £8 outside of London, and then it gets higher for all chains inside London, and up to £10.50 when it comes to Lidl and Aldi, the average pay for working in those supermarkets. And it's important to mention that the reason the King's Fund did that report wasn't to denigrate supermarket workers. It was that there was a practical problem in the care sector, which was that retaining staff is incredibly difficult because the conditions are awful and the pay is really low. And so people were moving from being care workers to working in supermarkets. I mean, it's depressing, but what matters in terms of retention of staff isn't so much is the pay any good, but it is are there alternatives which pay better? So this isn't how the left should be arguing, but in terms of a practical problem that was within the care sector, that comparison makes sense. Doesn't make sense in terms of putting moral value on anything, but in terms of retention of workers, you can see how that argument is a one that has some purpose at least. However, I said it's ambiguous because the BBC this year painted a slightly different picture. They used ONS data, that's the Office for National Statistics, to show the various pay levels for key workers compared to each other and compared to the median national wage. And in this case, they show carers as earning slightly more than shop assistants. I think we can get this graph up now. So you can see the key workers who are paid the worst are pharmacy assistants, then cleaners, then teaching assistants, then shop assistants, and then care workers. So a slightly different story there. But obviously, when it comes to the politics of this and when it comes to what Labour frontbenchers should be saying in Parliament, the point isn't whether cleaners get paid more than teaching assistants or less than teaching assistants, or whether care workers get paid more than shop assistants. It's that all of these essential jobs, people who are doing some of the most difficult jobs in society and some of the most necessary jobs in society, are getting paid a pittance. They're getting paid poverty wages. You can make that point without pitting one group of workers against another group of workers. Dalia, my final question for you. We saw a big Twitter backlash to what was said there by Liz Kendall. We know that, I mean, I think understandably and probably quite rightly, Keir Starmer's team don't see a Twitter drama as essentially something they should respond to. In this case, though, I think the Twitter row was quite representative, actually, of broader society. Do you think this is something that they're going to roll back from? Do you think she'll get a slap at the wrist for this? Or do you think they'll say, oh, no, actually, that was a great point and we're sticking by it? Screw the haters.
I mean, I think what we're much more likely to see is just silence. And the problem with that is the double standard. The problem is that for, left-wing MPs or MPs with socialist leanings, they can be fired for a tweet that in itself is innocuous and doesn't say anything remotely problematic. But when there is a tweet or a public statement that directly contradicts with, I mean, the term is meaningless at this point, but, Labour values, the basic premise of Labour values that even a Tory can find it within themselves to hold, that, there is sort of silence and passivity. And I think it is, again, part of this calculation by Keir Starmer, which is if we can be seen to either match or even outflank the Tories at some point on some issues, but be seen as the kind of more competent and slightly less corrupt version of the Tories, then that is their pathway to power, is through those disaffected Conservative voters, of which there aren't really enough to win an election, I don't think, and which we have already seen even on his own terms and in that strategy that they are failing. They are actually becoming less popular with disaffected or movable Conservative voters. So I think that, whatever Keir Starmer's personal opinion on it is, I think what we will see is a kind of, inaction rather than an endorsement or a repudiation. And it is because, as I've sort of mentioned multiple times, the objective of the Keir Starmer leadership is to demobilise and purge the Labour Party of its left-wing socialist tendencies in order not just to remove the remnants of Jeremy Corbyn, but to prevent the possibility of another Jeremy Corbyn. Now, that doesn't mean that necessarily that's going to be successful, but that is what the purpose of the Keir Starmer leadership is. And so within that context, there is no need to bare their teeth against, someone like Liz Kendall in the way that he did for other left-wing Labour MPs. So essentially, the problem here is not, oh, you didn't reprimand this MP for a tweet. The problem is that you hold some MPs to this very, very particular, often illogical standard, and yet you let other statements that are very reactionary or who come from reactionary politicians within the Labour Party slide. And so that double standard tells us everything we need to know about the image that the Labour Party is trying to put out for itself.
A depressing end to the show tonight. Dalia, Gebrial, it's been a pleasure as always. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you for having me. Sorry about that. I wish I ended on a nice note, but yeah, you guys can have a little bit of doom as a treat.
Yeah, you can drown your sorrows now, so it's all okay. Thank you everyone for your donations and comments tonight. We'll be back on Friday at 7 p.m. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.